I now give the floor to His Excellency Eamon Courtenay, Minister for Foreign Affairs, Foreign Trade and Immigration of Belize.
Mr. President, it is with immense pride that Belize offers its heartiest congratulations to the President of this General Assembly. He is a CARICOM national who was unanimously elected to preside over the 78th session of this General Assembly. The theme for our general debate, Rebuilding Trust and Reigniting Global Solidarity, is timely. When we act in good faith, when we respect the rule of law, when we embrace our responsibility to act in the common interests of humankind, when we foster unity for a larger purpose, we manifest these principles. Trust and solidarity are foundational to multilateralism. Regrettably, sir, trust and solidarity are in diminishing supply at a time when the capacity of planet Earth to sustain human life is in grave peril. Mr. President, the 0.7% ODA GNI target, first agreed in 1970, has never been met. By one estimate, this failure has resulted in $6.5 trillion in undelivered aid to developing countries. At COP15, developed countries committed to mobilize $100 billion per year by 2020 for climate action. That commitment has yet to be met. Consequently, US $381.6 billion in public finance, climate finance has been foregone. The commitment made in 2015 in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda to phase out fossil fuel subsidies has been completely ignored. According to the IMF, fossil fuel subsidies surged to a record $7 trillion last year. Despite their strident calls for respecting human rights, the Global North remains outside the Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers. Deaths and inhumane treatment of migrants at the southern borders of the Western world continue with impunity. The hoarding of COVID-19 vaccines by developed countries and their continuing refusal to waive intellectual property rights for COVID-19 vaccines cause prolonged suffering in the developing world, with some countries still below global vaccine targets. Mr. President, mistrust is widespread. Solemn promises are routinely broken. Narrow nationalism and insularity have displaced global solidarity. Indeed, the situation is critical. Only 12% of the SDGs are on track for achievement. For the first time, the Human Development Index declines globally for 2 years in a row, placing greater burdens on the most vulnerable. Poverty and food insecurity are rising. Hunger is at a level not seen since 2005, a major regression. High inflation has returned. The global average temperatures for the last 3 months were the highest on record. Yet, G20 countries, who are responsible for 80% of greenhouse gas emissions, are failing in their duty to drastically curb their emissions. Keeping 1.5 alive is slipping from our grasp. The development financing gap is widening, putting development out of reach for low-income and vulnerable countries. our governments face a callous choice between Scylla and Charybdis, expensive debt payments, or acquiring even more debt to invest in development and resilience. More than half of the world's top 50 most climate vulnerable countries are home to 40% of people living in extreme poverty. But as they represent only 2.5% of the global economy, their debt distress falls through the global financial cracks. Paradoxically, accompanying the progressive erosion of trust and solidarity is the inclination to further dig in, to deny the science, to dismiss the perspectives of others, to retreat into like-minded spaces, and to stoke more division. The spaces for dialogue and cooperation are closing. Polarization and fragmentation are trending. Mr. President, too much is at stake. Our existence and our prosperity, our way of life and our future. In answer, Mr. President, Belize proposes 3 broad actions which are urgent and necessary to restore trust and to foster solidarity. We are living now with the tragic consequences of 20th century multilateralism institutions and their governing mechanisms that are ill-suited for the crises of the 21st century. Urgent reform of the international financial architecture is imperative. The objectives and policies of international financial institutions must be better aligned with our climate and development goals. The eligibility criteria, which currently excludes some vulnerable countries from access to development finance, must be reformed to take account of vulnerabilities. The governance of IFIs must be broadened to include the voices of developing countries. Decisions for us cannot be made without us. The upcoming annual meetings in Marrakesh, the realization of the MDB vision emanating from the Paris Summit, the Bridgestone Initiative, and the prototype Multidimensional Vulnerability Index are all real reforms that would reinvigorate genuine trust in the international financial system. We must all seize the day. Events of the last decades have shown how ineffective the United Nations Security Council is and the dangerous vacuum which arises therefrom. Threats to international peace and security demand an effective council, one that is inclusive with equitable representation that reflects today's global dynamics. Mr. President, the inability of the Council to act in the face of the illegal Russian invasion and the illegal Russian war against Ukraine exemplifies the Council's impotence. Reform of the current Council is urgent, and Belize calls for the commencement of text-based negotiations in this session. Unmet commitments, insufficient to meet growing needs, have contributed to the huge financing gap we face today, to the stalling of climate and development agendas, and to the deepening of current crises. By course correcting immediately, we can begin to restore the trust and solidarity and get us on track to achieve the Paris goals and the SDGs. Mr. President, in truth, regrettably, we are all on the road to climate perdition. All of us, no one is exempt. The global stocktake to be concluded at COP28 is the unmissable opportunity to agree solutions to address the perilous gaps in implementation, accelerate climate action, and ramp up ambition. The just concluded SDG summit revealed the dire reality we face. The refusal of developed countries to so far raise the ambition on the means of implementation is disappointing. This must change. The 4th International Conference on Financing for Development is an important opportunity to forge a new financing pact for sustainable development. And while the implementation of SDGs occurs at the local level and governments bear primary responsibility for national development, we should be clear. Achieving SDGs is the shared responsibility of all countries. The SDGs are a bulwark against conflict and insecurity, the pull of migration and social instability. Mr. President, trust and solidarity can only thrive where there is justice. The terrible injustice and poison legacy of native genocide, slavery, and the transatlantic slave trade cannot continue to be ignored or to be the subject only of academic discussions. Descendants of slaves continue to struggle with persistent racial discrimination, marginalization, and generational trauma. The consequences of slavery for our countries manifest today through underdevelopment, poverty, and structural inequities. CARICOM has put forward a 10-point plan which addresses the core of reparatory justice as we see it. Reparatory justice is essential to any redemption from a historical wrong that is so indelible that it can never be fully remedied but must be reckoned with. To the governments of the European countries that enabled this evil, we say that the time for redemption, for respect, and for reparation is here, and we demand it. The decades-long call for climate justice must be answered. Small island developing states like Belize are the most vulnerable to climate change. Our countries are reaching the limits of adaptive capacity and already incurring loss and damage, and will continue to do so. Yet those whose economic prosperity and wealth have been based on climate-destroying activities are attempting to evade their historic responsibilities by lowering ambition on climate action, backsliding on implementation of their obligations, and refusing to deliver on climate finance. This blatant injustice, Mr. President, is compounded by the reality that to invest in resilience, to respond and recover from climate-induced disasters, we must borrow from the very same wealthy countries. Developed countries must urgently double adaptation financing and better align that financing to our growing needs. They must close the emissions and implementation gaps to keep 1.5 within reach. The Loss and Damage Fund must be operationalized and capitalized at COP28. We need adequate resources for just transitions to sustain our low-carbon economies and to further decouple our energy, transport, and electrical systems from high-polluting activities. Mr. President, too many of our member states continue to be oppressed by systematic but entirely repairable injustices. The ambivalence of the international community and the United Nations itself in response to the desperate call from Haiti for assistance is unconscionable. The Haitian people are suffering from unimaginable violence, human rights violations, and a humanitarian disaster. The CARICOM Eminent Persons Group is working to facilitate political consensus building that will be essential for Haiti's recovery. A broad-based political compact is urgently needed to transition to constitutional governance. Belize commends the offer of Kenya to lead a multinational force to provide security assistance to Haiti. Mr. President, Belize will join the other CARICOM countries in contributing to the multinational force once the appropriate framework is in place. And we call for the full funding of the Haiti Humanitarian Response Plan and a strong Security Council resolution to support the mobilization of the multinational force. Time flies. Haiti can wait no longer. Belize repeats its call for the immediate lifting of the illegal, immoral, and unjust commercial, financial, and economic blockade imposed on Cuba. The designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism by the United States of America is evil and pernicious. We deplore it, we condemn it, and we call for its immediate removal. In the post-Cold War dispensation, the American policy has no other objective but to cruelly punish ordinary Cubans and stifle their sustainable development aspirations. Indeed, the increasing imposition of unilateral coercive measures against Venezuela and other developing countries is both illegal and a significant obstacle to development. Mr. President, for more than half a century, the international community and the United Nations have failed to deliver a peaceful and secure state for the Palestinian people. Consequently, the people of Palestine continue to suffer the indignities and illegal occupation and Israeli apartheid. I reiterate Belize's full support for the realization of an independent Palestinian state within its 1967 borders, with all attendant rights, including the recognition of East Jerusalem as its capital and the right of return. The continued exclusion of Taiwan from the international community is inconsistent with the realities of today's world. Taiwan is a vibrant democratic country with the willingness and capacity to contribute to addressing global challenges. Belize calls for Taiwan's full inclusion in the international system. Regrettably, Russia's war against Ukraine continues with devastating effects, especially on civilians. We condemn the attempts to redraw international borders by force. Mr. President, this war must end. The price is too high. It is time for peace. The international community must urgently right the wrongs unceasingly and unnecessarily perpetrated against these countries. Doing so would serve immeasurably toward rebuilding trust and solidarity among our community of nations. Mr. President, as Belize and Guatemala continue to pursue the peaceful, just, and final resolution of Guatemala's claim to Belizean territory before the International Court of Justice, illegal incursions by Guatemalans continue. Recently, Guatemalan military forces illegally entered Belizean waters and unlawfully removed Belizean flags placed on Belizean soil. Deforestation, cattle ranching, and cultivation of illegal drugs by Guatemalans continue in remote and protected areas of Belize. These activities are contrary to international law and good neighborliness. Concluding a Sarsoon protocol to avoid unnecessary incidents in our southern and maritime space remains outstanding but necessary. Mr. President, solidarity originates from the Latin solidum, meaning to hold a debt together. All the member states of these United Nations hold a debt together. A debt to each other, a debt to our planet, a debt to leave a better world for future generations. By rebuilding trust and solidarity, we can advance the robust international cooperation that is indispensable for rescuing people and planet. Mr. President, let me close by quoting the words of the father of our Belizean nation, the Right Honorable George Price. He said, and I quote, "Creation was not finished at the dawn of this earth, but creation continues, and we have a lot to do to make the world a better place." End of quote. I thank you very much.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Foreign Trade and Immigration of Belize.